So hello and welcome everyone to Noble Desktop's live stream today for Intro to JavaScript. My name is Dan Rodney. I'm a course developer and an instructor at Noble Desktop. My background is both as a designer and a developer, so I like to call myself a diviner, developer designer. I like to do both. I like to be able to design web pages as well as build them. So I see it from both sides. And today we're going to be taking a look at the development side and coding JavaScript for web pages. We'll talk about what it is, how you can use it, and get into coding JavaScript. So I'm going to assume that you have some knowledge of HTML and CSS, that you've created at least some simple web pages, and we're going to be looking at just the JavaScript side of things today. I'm going to be switching over to do... Thank you for the music. There we go. Somebody mentioned that in the chat. Sorry about leaving that on there. So we are going to be... I'm going to be doing some code demonstrations. You also will be able to download the files that I'm demonstrating on, and then you can practice this later on. All right. So I'm going to switch over to do a screen share so that you can see some demonstration, and also I have a presentation that I'm going to walk us through that is going to be a bunch of notes and stuff that will be great reference for you later on. As far as Noble Desktop's background, though, just for a brief moment, we've been around for 26 years in New York City doing training. You can attend our classes in person, live in New York City, or you can attend online. So when you attend online, you just do a screen share into the instructor's computer, and kind of like you'd be watching a live stream here today, and you can watch the instructor demonstrating just like you would be in a class, but you're attending online. We also sell great step-by-step workbooks that we give out to students when they come to our classes, but we also sell them separately on our website, and they're indicated right beside me. That's just a little bit about us. We've been teaching design and code related technologies for the past 26 years, and we have certificates in web design. We teach HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and teach people how to create web pages, as well as other things like Adobe applications like Photoshop and Illustrator. We also teach Sketch for designing websites, user experience classes. So hopefully you'll check those things out. But let me go ahead and get started with today's topic, Intro to JavaScript. I'm going to switch over here to my screen share. And I see a question in the chat. If the screen is fuzzy, you should be able to adjust the quality of your stream. There should be a gear icon on the bottom right of the video. Click on that, and you can increase the quality of the stream there. If you're on a mobile device, there's probably a menu button on the top right corner, which is probably 3 dots. You can click on that, and then there should be a quality button that you can change. So just increase the quality of the video there. YouTube will adjust automatically depending on the quality of your internet streaming, but you can go in there and change it yourself if it's not defaulting to a high enough quality. We're streaming in Retina quality, so the screen should be very, very clear if you have a good enough internet connection to download it. All right, so first of all, this is a website that we have that we're going to leave live for you, nobledesktop.com/presentation/JS-intro-livestream. So this URL right here. You can go to that. We have that link in the video description, and I've also pasted into the chat for anybody attending live here. But we'll have it in the recording video, and right now it's in the video description if you're watching the live stream. And you just use your arrow keys to navigate around, or if you're on a touch device, you can swipe to go between these slides. So, first of all, JavaScript is not Java. A lot of people come up to me and say that they want to learn Java, and they want to learn it for web pages, and what they really mean to say is JavaScript. Java is completely different. If you're going to create an Android application, you can write those in Java. Java is a much higher level programming language, and you don't code web pages with Java. You typically code them with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So I know they share the same part, Java, but Java and JavaScript are totally different things. We're talking about JavaScript. And that's an important thing, because if you're ever going to Google something and look for an answer, you're going to get a totally different answer with Java than JavaScript. So as I said right here but just a second ago, JavaScript is a scripting language that we use to create interactivity on websites. You can also now do other things such as control web servers, now that it can be a server-side language as well. You can also do other things like automate Adobe apps and other things. So JavaScript, a lot of people think it's only for web pages, but you can also do a lot of things with JavaScript knowledge. We'll be mainly talking about using it in a web page today, but the core language itself, once people learned it for websites, they wanted to use it for more things. Whereas Java is an object-oriented programming language used to create standalone applications like Android apps. So, as I was just mentioning about JavaScript, you can use JavaScript in multiple places. So we don't want to think of it as only for web pages, although that's the primary focus of what we're going to be talking about today. So client-side, which means in a web browser, JavaScript can run in the browser, and you can access the elements that are in the web page. So you create those elements with HTML, and or you can also use JavaScript to create those as well. You style them with CSS, but JavaScript is going to interact and manipulate those web page elements that you have. You can also run JavaScript server-side. This is a newer thing than running it client-side in the browser, but once people knew JavaScript, they wanted to use that same syntax, that same language. Once you learn a language, you don't really want to learn another language if you don't have to. So what if you could reuse the same language that you know, but just use it for more things? So they now let us run JavaScript on the server side so that you can run it on a web server and access backend functionality, connecting to databases and file systems and interacting with the web server itself. We're not going to be getting into that today, but just wanted you to know that that is a potential use of JavaScript. So on the client side, we can change, we can add, we can remove HTML elements. So headings and images and inputs and whatever you create in HTML, you can interact with those. You can change them. You can also interact with their attributes. So you can add classes, you can change the source, you can change the values of form elements. So you can interact with the elements, their attributes of those elements. You can interact with CSS, so you can change the styling of those elements. And you can react to events. When the user clicks on something or taps or hovers over something, you can do it when a specific thing happens to a specific thing in the page. On the server side, we can run something like Node.js to control the server. So you can read and write databases, you can access files, and that is basically acting like PHP or Ruby on Rails. But instead of having to learn another language, PHP and Ruby on Rails are different languages, you can continue with your JavaScript knowledge and use Node.js so that the syntax, the base language is the same. You're doing different things, so there'd be different, some different calls, but the base syntax is going to work. So it's kind of like if you already know English, learning a few new words in English is much easier than learning Spanish. All right, so other uses for JavaScript. So we talked about using it in a web page, in a web server, but you can also run JavaScript in Adobe applications. For example, in Adobe InDesign or Photoshop or Illustrator, you can write what they call extend script, but it's essentially JavaScript. It's the same syntax, and they've just implemented JavaScript in their apps and called it extend script. And but once you know how to write JavaScript, you just have to learn how to interact with Adobe elements in their programs versus web page elements. The basic syntax is the same. And so you're going to automate the creation of documents, for example, and interact that when the user does something, you can do something else. So you can automate Adobe programs. So the main reason I'm talking about all of these potential uses is just to say that when you learn JavaScript, you're learning it in a big ecosystem, and it's worth learning because you can get a lot out of the knowledge of learning JavaScript. So let's take a look at some of the things that you can do with JavaScript. For example, here, there is a heading that types itself out, and that typing, that creation of that text over time is done using JavaScript. Also, the menu that's here, that sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. That there, it's initially when you're at the top of the page, but then when you scroll, it scrolls away. But then as soon as I start to scroll back up, let's say I'm further down on the page, if I start to scroll back up, it senses that I was scrolling back up and the menu reappears. That it sensed that I was further down the page and that I started scrolling up. JavaScript is watching for those things, whether you're scrolling up or down, and then doing something based on that. And so JavaScript makes that interactivity possible. In this case, Giphy, the page loads rather quickly, but these images didn't all load initially. That's why the page could load quickly, is because they're doing what's called lazy loading. When the page loads, it loads really quick without loading the images, and then once the page is loaded, it starts and goes and gets more images. And actually, as I scroll, you start to see that those images come in. If I beat it ahead of time, it shows me just some blank colors, and then it goes and gets more images. In fact, I kind of hit the limit of how many spots there are, and then as I hit that, JavaScript says, oh, he's at the bottom. Let's go grab some more images and load those in. So it's dynamically loading in images when I need to see them, rather than preloading a bunch of images. It would take a long time. So things like lazy loading can allow your website to feel a lot faster and actually perform a lot better. So JavaScript needs to see that you've scrolled and that you need to see more, and then react to that. You can't just do this with plain HTML and CSS. So JavaScript can do that. You can also do scrolling effects. So this website, it's a little bit of an older website, but it's still a good example of what JavaScript can do. As you scroll down at certain places, things come in. This is the story of a designer and a developer that got married, and she designed the website and he built the website. I think it's that order. I think she's the designer and he's the developer. And so based on certain scroll positions, things come in, things change. Yeah, designed by the bride, programming by the groom. So that you can do things based on position is a cool feature that JavaScript allows us to do. That's just kind of a fun example of something JavaScript can do. Another example of scrolling effects is this kind of parallax look where there's different rates of scrolling. So it kind of looks like they're on different planes. And then again, at certain points as I'm scrolling, things come in or things move. So all this animation of when it happens in your scroll position and what happens in terms of animation, that is all happening using JavaScript. You could do things like filtering systems. So here on our books page, which are available in both print and ebook, if you want to learn more. For example, you can go to learn about Photoshop, and here's some Photoshop books. Or you can go back to web and see the web development books. That filtering system that's there is done with JavaScript. So based on you clicking a certain tag, it then hides the ones you don't want to see and shows you the ones that you do want to see. Google Maps. When Google Maps first came out, it was just revolutionary compared to all the competitors that were out there. And if you remember back to when MapQuest ruled, and it was a small little image, and you'd have to hit a button to reload the whole page, reload a whole new image, and then you'd have to figure out where you were. You'd have to reorient yourself. This was just a breath of fresh air that you could just move and keep your context of where you were, and that you could zoom in and zoom out right there. And one of the ways that this works is using something called Ajax, and that allows us to go fetch data that is not currently in the web page. So they don't load the entire world map up front, because that would take a long time to load. Based on you scrolling, when you hit the kind of end of the data that was loaded, they'll just go and grab more data. If you zoom out and it didn't know all the information, it'll go download the rest of that information. So JavaScript can load things that aren't initially loaded. So that way your initial load can load quickly, and then you can load additional data as necessary into your page. And it just allows a level of interactivity that you can't achieve without JavaScript. There was a question about, can Adobe After Effects do extend script basically automate it with JavaScript. I believe it can. I'm not sure because I don't typically use After Effects myself. So you'd have to check on the Adobe website. But I believe that I know that Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign can. So I would expect that Adobe After Effects can be automated with JavaScript as well. And there was a question in the chat as far as will the website work when viewed on an iPad? A lot of JavaScript is going to work fine across all browsers. You do sometimes have to be careful about the difference between a click event and a tap event, depending on how you're programming things. So there might be some things you have to do to support touch screen devices separately. But as far as basic things, a lot of that stuff just works fine whether you're on a touch device or a non-touch device. So that's what JavaScript does. Kind of gives you some background to it, but let's actually see some coding fundamentals. First of all, where do we put our code? And I'm going to get into actually showing you how to do code and give you some examples and get us started in a moment. But a couple kind of background things first about how we're supposed to do the code and where we're supposed to put it is important. So when we're putting JavaScript, we can, of course, make a separate JavaScript file and link our web page to it. But whether we're embedding the JavaScript code into the page or whether we're just putting a link to a JavaScript file, you can put JavaScript or a link to JavaScript anywhere basically in your document. You can put it in the head, you can put it anywhere in the body, but what does matter is the load order. So if an HTML element comes first in your code, and I'll show you an example of this in a little bit, but if an HTML element comes first, which means it comes at the top, and then you load the JavaScript that talks to it, generally you're going to be fine. But if you put your JavaScript first and then you create the element, if JavaScript tries to talk to an element that hasn't been created yet, it will just throw an error. It's not going to wait around and say, you know what, I think maybe he'll eventually get around to loading this thing. I'll just hang out here and wait. No, it runs right away, and if an element hadn't been created yet, it just craps out and says, no, freaks out, done, stops, breaks your code. So in general, it's best to put the JavaScript at the bottom of the document, whether you're linking to JavaScript or embedding the JavaScript. That way, if you put it at the bottom, you know that all the elements have loaded and your JavaScript can talk to any of those elements. So some terminology that we're going to use as I'm writing the code. JavaScript has something called objects. And the way that I think of the things in JavaScript are in terms of like English language. If you think of an object, that's a noun, right? So an object is basically like a bundle of information packaged together, and it can have all sorts of attributes to it. Basically, everything in JavaScript is an object. It's a thing that you can work with and manipulate. So I'll give you some examples in a moment. But an object is basically a thing. A property is more like an adjective. A property is kind of descriptive. And you take your object, and that object can have properties. So if you have a car, what's the color of the car, for example? And the way that you write it is you would have object, and then if you do a dot property, so this would be the object name, and this would be the property name. So you can get properties and find out what they are, and then later you can change them as well, depending on the property. So if properties are an adjective and are kind of descriptive, methods are verbs. They're action items. So a method is something that you can do. It's going to do a task. And you have the method name followed by parentheses. So here, the property does not have parentheses after it, but the method will have parentheses. And finally, the last main kind of concept here is functions. A function is basically a collection of code that says, hey, let me just group all this code together and just wait for you to tell me when you want me to run. So a function just kind of organizes it, puts it in a room and says, stay here and wait until I come back and tell you to work. And when I do, when I call your name, go ahead and do all the stuff that I put together here. So you're creating like a custom collection. And it looks very much like a method. You have the method name parentheses, or you have the function name parentheses. The main difference is that a method would be something that's kind of predefined, whereas a function is something that you define yourself. So you create the functions. But there's still a thing that happen, a thing that's like more of an action item, a verb. So that's why it looks much like a method. If you didn't create it though, it's a method. If you created it, it's a function, essentially. So conceptual examples, not realistic examples in a web page. We'll get to those in a moment, but just conceptually, an object could be a car. So if you're writing the object name, car would be the object name. And then it also has further objects that are put as kind of part of it. So you can break objects into further pieces. Like people have eyes and we have arms. Well, cars have doors. Even within a door, there's windows. So each of these are objects because the window is a thing, the door is a thing, the car is a thing. Even though those kind of nested objects, if you will, are kind of inside of the car, related to the car, they are still objects in and of themselves. A property of the car would be something that describes the car, like the color. So car.color, notice no parentheses after that. That if you query that and you find out, hey, what's the car color? It would return the car values, the car's color value. So red or blue or purple, whatever it is. Also, the door might have an open property. Is it open or not? So then it would return true or false, whether it's open or not. It wouldn't actually open the window, which would be a method. Notice that the only difference here between this and this is the parentheses. The parentheses are implying an action happening. Car.door.open would actually open the door. It wouldn't return whether it is open or not. That would be the property that you would have to query. Now, the open method might be able to be used in different things, like you can open a door and you can open a window. So every property has a certain set of given properties and methods, things you can find out about them, things you can change about them, and things you can do to them. That's the basic idea of a lot of JavaScript. When you're working with these real elements in a web page, we call that the document object model, or the DOM for short. The document object model is the elements within a web page. At its highest level, we have the window of the web page. In fact, right now, I am in a web page, so I am in a window. They break window down into sub things. So you have the document that's in there, but you don't only have the document, you also have the location of it. So you have the URL. You have a history, right? So there's back and forth that you can do. There's also a console that we'll talk about in a moment, where as a developer, you can log things to the console. End users don't see that, but it's useful as a developer. So these are all things that you might not necessarily think about, but they're all in the window. So they're all kind of children of the window element. Now, document is further broken down into, as an HTML page, there's a head and there's a body. Within the body, you have all the other potential elements you might have within a web page, and these are just some examples of things. So when we're manipulating things within a web page, we need to talk to the proper element within the web page, and we access that by interacting with the DOM, or the document object model. So now let's go ahead and I'm going to show you some code for you to download later. You'll be able to download the same files that I'm going to be demonstrating on. So just know that they're accessible. We keep this page up, so you will be able to download these files whenever you want. You don't have to feel like you have to follow along. You can do that later, but during the demo here, I'll just be using these files that I've already downloaded. We have a question in the chat about how would extend script different from actions. Anything that is built into the program is somewhat limited in a way. Like actions are great because they don't require coding in Photoshop, but they don't have a lot of if-then logic as much as you can with extend script. Also with extend script, you can actually create user interfaces. You can actually create dialogues that then accept input from the user and then do something based on that input. So an action can't create a user interface and ask for the size of something. So for example, in InDesign, I have a thing called Make Book Jacket, which creates jackets for books. And you can just enter in the sizes because I create a dialog. You enter in all the sizes and click OK, and it builds out the document. Even if InDesign had actions, it wouldn't be able to accept the various sizes you want, do some math on them, and then perform that action. So actions in Photoshop are great, but if you want more interactivity and more variability, then extend script could give you more control. Okay, so the files that I've already downloaded here are broken down into a few sections. I'm going to start talking about JavaScript, and then we'll move into jQuery and GreenSock, and I'll explain what those things are. Now, I've already loaded this into my code editor, Sublime Text, but it doesn't really matter what code editor you like to use. It would still essentially work the same way. I'm just going to walk us through a couple files here, and most of the time, if I had more time, I would actually go through and kind of more type out the code. But for reference for you, I thought that if I commented out some of the code, it would be better because you can just comment out some of the code and then uncomment some of the other code. So first of all, before we even pay attention to any of this stuff here, let's just look at this part right here. Notice that I have a script tag. So we put script tags in any place within our document. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but like I said before, you can put that script tag anywhere in your document. For right now, I'm putting it in the head, and this is going to create an alert. Now, I mentioned before that the window object was the top level object. Everything is basically in the window element. And alert is a method. We're going to alert, but what are we going to alert? We want to tell them something. So an alert is just a dialogue, and you can put something into that dialogue. And right now, I'm just going to say hello. I'm going to undo all the deletion of that code, so just ignore that for right now. We're just going to pay attention to this little line right here. The semicolon at the end just says that's the end of my JavaScript statement. As long as you're putting them on different lines, technically that is an optional thing. But if you're ever going to have multiple code on the same line, then you need to put that semicolon so that it knows that one JavaScript statement is done and it will move on to the next one. Okay, so I'm going to preview this in my browser. So I have F12 set up to preview in my browser, but your code editor might have a different keystroke, or however you want to preview it, you can just drag it into your browser. Since I didn't put any qualifier on that code, I didn't say when that code should happen, the code is executed immediately upon page load. So right away, as soon as the page opens, an alert pops open and it says hello. I know this isn't very practical right now, but we just want to start with something very simple, and we're going to work up to more complicated examples. Oh, question in the chat, can you use JavaScript in Microsoft Word? My understanding is no, because they have their own VB scripting language. So VB script is a scripting language, but it's not JavaScript. So Microsoft has their own proprietary scripting language. Okay, so I'm going to click OK, and then the page loads. This happened very first thing before it actually even got to the body. So it didn't even render the body before it popped open that alert. Now, the first thing that I want to explain here is that window is assumed because everything is in the window. So if I delete window and just have alert, even though alert is a method of the window object. So we have the window object, and that window object lets us open alerts. Window's just always assumed. So even just saying alert is fine. If I preview that, it still works. So you might see it sometimes written window.alert, sometimes just alert. Now, alerting is kind of annoying because it always makes you click OK. And if you want to put a bunch of alerts, you have to click and click and click. It's kind of annoying. So I'm going to comment this out by typing //. // in JavaScript comments out that line so that that code no longer works. And that way, I can still keep that on my screen, but I can move on to some other code. I'm going to save that, come back to my browser and hit refresh. And notice that nothing happens because I commented out that code and it no longer works. And now I can go to some other code and uncomment that out by removing the double slashes. A better example of kind of pulling some information into the page and letting us see what's going on is to console log. It is also part of the window object, although again, the window object is assumed, so you wouldn't even need to include window. You could just say, hey, talk to the console and log something. Instead of putting it into an alert, put it into the console. And this is the thing that we're putting in. So again, when you're writing methods are the name of the method with parentheses. And the thing that you want to do is often put inside of that parentheses there. So this is going to say something in the console. So I'm going to save that, come back, and refresh. Now to a regular user, they don't see the console. So how do you access the console? You control click or right click and inspect this element on the page. In here, you can switch to the console, and you can see. So we said something in the console. So that was output into the console because of my statement. Okay, so now that we know that we can console log something, let's do some other JavaScript stuff. Now to easily comment something in or out, if you're using Sublime Text, you can hit on the Mac Command/ or Control/ on Windows to add or remove a comment. So I'm just hitting this keystroke Command/ on the Mac or Control/ on Windows, and it knows to comment or uncomment. So I can just hit that keystroke. So let's do a new concept here, variables. Now, a variable is a piece of information that you want to store so you can access it later on. I'm going to create a variable called username. Now, I can name my variables whatever I want, and I can then make that equal to a value. So I can store that value, and I can use it over and over and over again. The name is something that I'm just coming up with. It's just a place to store some piece of information. What am I going to do with it? I want to put that into the console. I want to say, hey, console, log the username, which usernames, it has a meaning. It's like a metaphor. Username means, right now, it means Dan. So when I preview this in the browser and I hit refresh, it says Dan in the console. Now, I want to point out something about quotes, because here I've been kind of not talking about the quotes. What if I put quotes around this? JavaScript doesn't care whether I use single quotes or double quotes. I typically use single quotes because if you're ever interacting with HTML, HTML likes double quotes. So I just make the rule of HTML is double quotes and JavaScript is single quotes. As long as you keep them separate, you won't have a problem. So I like to use single quotes for my JavaScript, but technically double quotes will work just fine. If I just put quotes around it, literally it's going to quote what I say. And when you quote someone, you're supposed to quote them verbatim, word for word, exactly. So this will actually literally put the word username into the console. Let's go and refresh. So it actually says username. So anytime you put quotes, it's a literal interpretation, and it says literally put username into the console. But if you don't have those quotes, then it knows not to take you literally and figure out that there's some meaning to username. Hey, let's go find out what that means. Oh, username means Dan, and it will put in the meaning rather than the word username. So as an example, let me comment out those and comment this. So here, I'm creating a variable called some number. You can name this whatever you want. You can name it Bob for all I care, but some number means something. So here's just some number 5. Now it's not the character 5. It's the number 5. And there's a difference between the character 5 and the number 5. If you add two numbers together, 5 plus 5 should be 10. So JavaScript can do math. Some number, which means 5, plus some number, which means 5. 5 plus 5 should mean 10. So let's go ahead and try that out. So we get 10 in the console. Let me make this a little bit bigger just in case you guys can't see that in the stream as well. Now, here's a cool thing. So let's say I change 10. Now it's 10 plus 10. So I should get 20 in the console. Now, what's the difference if I put quotes around that? And let's go back to 5. So if I put 5 in quotes, it's literally going to take me, for what I'm saying, put a 5 character plus a 5 character. And this is what we call concatenation. You're putting together two strings. So it's putting a 5 and a 5 next to each other. You can only add math. You can actually only add numbers. If you're adding strings, as we call them, this is called a string of characters. It doesn't matter what the characters are. You know, this could say, could be some big number here. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Whatever is in those quotes is going to be put there plus put there. Okay. If I put in a space inside the quotes, it will take that literally and put it inside. However, JavaScript really doesn't care about quotes outside. So if you put a quote out here, it doesn't care. And it won't put the quote there. Why? Well, because if you have the quote inside, it literally says, I'm going to put those characters, including a space character, into there. Okay. So let's do one more example here. If my character is 5 and it's a character, right? Not a number, but a character, that character plus that would equal, it would actually output 5 and 5 next to each other. But I can also put a string here to say the number is, put a space because I want a space to be after this piece of text, and then concatenate on the character that's going to be the character 5. So here I get the character plus character, and the number is, or the character is 5, right? So this could be the character. And this could be, let's say it's ABC. right? That's the characters that I have. So then I get ABC and ABC, and the character is ABC. So this is a way that we can do math, put things together, and you might think, well, why would I want to do this? Well, if you want to output something to the user and you're taking something that they did and then creating a message, you might need to create that message to output it to the user. So I know these are very kind of simple examples, but they will end up being very useful as we go forward. Okay, so let's continue on here. We can get properties of elements. So let's log the window's inner width. So how wide is the window? Let's preview this in the browser. I'm logging that to the console, so I must control click or right click and inspect to open up, and I'll go to the console. So right now it's 1440. Now if I resize my browser window and make it a little smaller and refresh the page, anytime the page loads, it's going to output into the console how big it is. I haven't done any events yet that say to continually do it. Right now I'm just doing it upon page load, so I know how big the window was when the page loaded. So you can get the width. Notice there's no parentheses for inner width. The console log is a thing that's being done, so that's a method. That is the action, and what you put inside, we're actually getting a property, and that's just information we're getting. Now other methods, so we've done console log. What about printing a window? If you've ever seen a print button, they're tying this to a button. We'll talk about events and tying it to elements later. But right now we could just say print the window. Now this is going to happen upon page load because I haven't tied it to a particular element. And also technically, again, we can just say print, but because window is always assumed. But let's do window.print. As soon as the page loads, it brings up the print dialog like so. Normally you would bind this to a button that when you click the button, it then does that type of JavaScript. But one line of code can print the window. Pretty interesting. Now this one you would not want to do upon page load. This is going to be kind of fun. You might want to do this with a button to close the window, but check this out. I'm going to come back here. And so this is the page getting started with JavaScript. When I refresh it, boop, it goes away. The window would be a tab if it's a tab. In that case, it was a tab. So notice I have 3 tabs open here. If I comment out that for just a moment and then preview it again, so I get a 4th tab. And if that is uncommented, so it will work, it will close the window. And notice my 4th tab will go away when I hit refresh. Okay. So there's lots of different methods, things that you can do. There's lots of different properties, information you can find out. Now let's go in and talk to elements within the web page. Here I have a heading and I've given it an ID. An ID is a unique thing that it's a name that I put on one individual element within the document. I'm going to try to access that element. Within the window, there's the document. And I could say window.document, but Windows always assumed, so you don't have to say that. So within the window, there's a document. And within the document, one of the methods that we can use is to get an element by its ID. So this is the method that you're doing. Now, within there, what is the element that you want to get? What's the ID? So in quotes, we give it the string, the text of the ID. And then once we've gotten that element, what do we want to find out about that element? Inner HTML is a property of elements. So you can find out what's the HTML code inside of this. Now, right now, we're just getting the element. We're not actually doing anything with it. But let's just see what happens. Oh, I got to preview this page in the browser. I closed it before. So the console throws an error. Uncaught type error. Cannot read property inner HTML. If I click on this, it'll actually go there and show me the code. So it's just saying, yeah, that code right there, that's not working. Now, I mentioned earlier about talking to an element before the element's been created. So it cannot read the property inner HTML of null. It says null because here, if you're reading from top to bottom, you're talking to my heading, but my heading is not going to have been created until after that code is executed. So we don't want to put this code up here in the head. That's why I wanted to start with it in the head, but really we want to do it in the body. So here I have another copy of the same code down here in the body. It's the same thing, but the importance here is that it's after the element has been created. After we've created my heading, I can then go and get that element because now it's been created. The same exact code, just changing the position, now it's going to work. So I no longer get that error. I haven't done anything with it yet, but at least I no longer get the error because I'm trying to get something that exists now versus trying to get something before it exists. So you can't go wrong by putting your script after all the stuff. You know, right before the end of the body tag, you can never go wrong with putting your code there. All right, so what do we want to do? Well, let's take that thing that I just did and log it to the console so that we can see what is the inner HTML. Getting started with JavaScript. So that's the inner HTML. That's what's inside of that heading. Okay, so we can get it. Now let's try to change it. So we don't have to log this to the console because we don't actually ultimately want to log things to console. We just do that to test. Users want to see something change. So let's tell the document to get the heading by ID. Let's talk to its inner HTML, which we know is the text, and let's set it equal to a new string of text, something completely different. So right now it says getting started with JavaScript, and then it will change to JavaScript change this heading. Save that. It's going to happen immediately when the page loads. So notice that this is how it is before I hit refresh. And then boom, we've changed the text. Again, right now we're just doing this on page load. You normally do this based on when somebody does something in the page, and we're getting up to that. We're working up towards that. Okay. So the reason we're doing the console right now is really just for us to practice and see in a very simple way, is the stuff that we're working with, is it actually working? And then you get to more tangible examples, like now we're going to start to see how we can use this with elements that are actually in the page. So let's preview this page and see what's going on. This is a form field where you can enter in some text. And if you've ever clicked into a form field and then had to delete the initial text and been annoyed, I'm right there with you. That annoys me. Now, HTML5 technically has a placeholder attribute, which you can use that as soon as you click into it, you can start typing and the placeholder text is automatically deleted. That is the best way to do this. But as a learning example, I want to use this as a potential example just to explain getting properties and setting properties and doing a bunch of cool things. So ultimately, you should really use the HTML5 placeholder attribute. But that said, let's see how we can work with an actual element on the page. All right, so I have a little bit of JavaScript already. I'm logging in the document. I'm going to get the element by ID of email. So what is email? Well, up here we have an input, email. So that is the text input. So that's this thing, the thing that says you@website.com. So notice its initial value is you@website.com. So I'm getting that element and I'm getting its value, which is this. So this should, in theory, log you@website.com, if that works. Value being a property of the email element. So let's open up the console. You@website.com. Okay. So a lot of times, just to do this kind of very simply, I like to log something to the console just to make sure that my initial thought works and just to make sure it's working. And then I actually will go in and do the thing that I want to do. So let's set that value equal to something. Before we change it to a different piece of text. Now let's change the value equal to, and we're going to just put two single quotes with nothing in between. Because if I put a space there, it's actually going to type a space in there and they'd have to delete the space. I don't want anything. I'm literally going to delete the value by setting it equal to nothing at all. So when the page loads, it just deletes that value. Now we don't want to do it when the page loads. So let's see how to get more realistic here. What we want to do instead is create what's called a function. So a function is going to let you put some code together. It could be many statements. It could just be one. But the main thing that the function does is it says, hold this code and don't execute it until you tell me to. So putting it into a function says, let me define it, but don't do it upon page load. So all I've done is I've just taken the same code and I put it inside of a function. And to create a function, kind of like we create a variable, we say variable and then the name. Here we say function and then the name. But a variable does not have the parentheses after. A function does, because a function is going to be executed. So it's a little bit more like a method. It's going to happen. It's going to be executed. The curly braces put together all the stuff in the function. So technically you could put this on one line if you wanted to. This is the function definition, like it says create a function with this name, and then the curly braces say put all this stuff together. But it's easier if you put them on different lines. So that way, if you have multiple lines where you're doing different things, you know, this starts the function and that ends it, and you can have all the things you want to do inside of that function. So by doing that, right now nothing's going to happen when I load this page because we've never told that function to actually be executed. So when I load the page, it's no longer wiping that away. So when is that code going to happen? When we click into this input, it would be nice to do that so that when you click into it, that's when you should clear it. So we call this clear field. We could have named it whatever we wanted to, but on here, I'm going to add, and you can add it anywhere you want. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to type it in here. I'm going to do on focus. On focus is a little bit better than on click because on click would only work when you literally click there, not when you tab into it with your keyboard. If you use focus, it doesn't matter how you attain focus, whether it's a click or tab, it will always, upon focus, do this particular action. And we're just basically taking this function name and calling it. So the onFocus event is actually built into your HTML, but it's onFocus is always calling JavaScript. So now if I hit refresh, nothing happens until I click into that field, and then it wipes it away. Or because I did onFocus, I could hit my tab key, and then it wipes it away as well. If I had just done onClick, then clicking would work, but when I tab, it wouldn't work. So onFocus is a little bit of a nicer event. So these are called event handlers. When is this going to be triggered? At what event? And your browser just tracks these events. So these events are given to you, things like onClick, onFocus, are given to you by the browser, tracked by the browser. All right, let's go into another example here where you might have a button that says menu, and when you click on it, it can open up. For example, that might be useful when you're on a mobile device and you don't want to show everything until they click, and then you can see it. I know this has just been done with very, very minimal styling, but that's so that we don't get hung up on all the CSS and the aesthetics. We're just focusing on the functionality of what it does. You can obviously do better styling and make it more interesting. Okay. Oh, so there was a question, how am I activating and deactivating the lines of code so quickly? I am hitting a keystroke. In Sublime Text, it's toggle comment. Command backs I always forget if it's forward or backward. Command slash. On Windows, it would be control slash. So I'm just hitting the keystroke. If your code editor does not have a keystroke for it, you would just delete the 2 lines or type the 2 lines. But to make that quicker, Sublime Text has that keystroke to toggle the comment on or off. So command slash or control slash activates or deactivates. And then when I go to the browser, I'm just hitting refresh in the browser. Okay, so let's go back to our more tangible example. All right, so we've already got the basic functionality, but how does this work? Okay, let's take a look. We've got a menu here that has all of our elements, and we got the word menu. Initially, this page navigation menu is hidden. We use CSS to do that. This is called page nav. And that would be, oh, actually, just nav, right? So up here, nav. So nav, by default, is display none. Because in CSS, if you say display none, you won't display it at all. Now, we also have another style that says .open, and that would be adding an open class to it. If there's an open class, then it would display as block. So right now, if I just inspect the page, and let's make this a little bigger so you guys can see this. If I go in to the nav, if I add a class to this, class equals open, because I have that style ready, and that style says to display block, it changes from display none to display block. Because I have that CSS ready, all I have to do with JavaScript is to remove the class when I don't want it open, or to add the class when I do want it open. So CSS is really the thing that is actually hiding and showing the menu technically, but we need JavaScript to be able to trigger that CSS. Okay, so JavaScript is going to be the how it actually works, right? Like when it works based on user input. Okay. So you still have to know CSS to be able to style elements and control the look of them. So what we did is we created two functions. One function to open the menu, and that says, hey, go into the document, get by ID the page nav, right? Which is this page nav right here. Let me zoom out one there so you can see this. And we said, add a class, right? Or just set the class to open, right? There was no class there. Since there was no class, it will add open and it'll open the menu. But normally a function doesn't happen until you tell it to. So on the word menu, there's a link, and on click, when you click that thing, it will fire that function off, and it will do that function. Now also, if we only opened it, how would they close it? So within the menu, there is a little X. When you click on that, we fire off the function close menu. And the close menu function basically removes that class, talks to the same element, but instead of adding open, it sets the class equal to nothing at all. And by setting it equal to nothing at all, it has no class, and therefore it removes it. So let's see that again here. But this time I'm going to have the inspector open when I show this. And I'm going to show that within the body, watch this class here. I'm going to reload the page, and notice that initially when the page loads, there is no class on that element. But when I click menu, notice how it even flashes. When JavaScript interacts with something in the DOM, Chrome will flash the element that's changing so that you know that JavaScript just did that. And then that removed the class. So it added open. Now, technically, it didn't remove class. There's still class. It's just class doesn't equal anything. That's perfectly fine. It doesn't hurt anything. If you wanted to be just a little bit cleaner, instead of just changing the class name, you could do something a little different. You could use a different method called remove attribute. Lots of things have attributes in HTML. There's anchor tags have an href attribute, or an onClick attribute, or a class, or an ID. Those are all attributes. So which attribute do we want to just remove? We could just remove the class attribute, and then of course it would have no class at all. Either one would work. That one would technically be a little bit cleaner though. So now if I refresh the page, it has no class to begin with. When I click on it, it sets class equal to open. And now when I close it, it removes the class entirely because it removed that class attribute. Okay. So now we're starting to get into more practical things that you typically are going to put your code into functions that are going to happen based on user input. As we write our code, if I do the same thing, the same page, right? So this is the same page, same functionality, right? The code that I used to have here, I put into a JavaScript file. So here's a JavaScript file. Typically you put it in a JavaScript folder. You don't have to put it in a folder, but a lot of times you do. This is just the JavaScript code that makes it work. It's the open menu that adds the open class. It's the close menu function that adds it says to remove the class attribute. That's the code that actually made that work. In the HTML, we still have the onClick methods that call those functions, but the actual JavaScript code is separated into a separate file. Sorry, wrong document here. This one here. But we've linked to it. So when you say script source, and then you put a link to your JavaScript file, kind of like you link to a CSS file, the main advantage is by sharing that JavaScript file, by externalizing that JavaScript file, you make it shareable. So just like we externalize CSS files, we externalize JavaScript files, so that if lots of pages within your site need access to that same functionality, if you ever need to change the functionality, you only have to change one file. Because you can link, with the same link, you can link a lot of pages to the same JavaScript. All the pages will access it, and if you ever update it, all the pages will be updated. So you can embed JavaScript into the page, or you can link to it. Where you put this link is important, because as we learned earlier, if something happens before those elements, then the JavaScript code might not work. So this would be when that JavaScript is fired off. So it's not a problem to link at the bottom. You know that all your elements are going to be loaded, and so if you put it at the bottom, you really can't go wrong by putting your JavaScript link at the bottom. If you don't need to share that JavaScript with other pages, if that JavaScript only applies to this particular page, you don't have to externalize it. But if you're going to share it with other pages, then you want to externalize it so you can share it across multiple pages. One last example here with JavaScript before we move on to other things like jQuery and GreenSock is testing. A lot of times we need to do something based on if this is true or if that's true, do different things depending on what's happening. So here we have a heading. It's called my heading. And we're going to change the text of that based on what happens. We're just embedding it into this page just to keep it simple so I don't have to switch files. We're going to create a variable called my number. It can be any number. It doesn't really matter. We're going to test different numbers. We'll start with the number 10. Here's a test. It's called an if test. And if you break down the basics of what this is, let me just delete this. If you think about a test, you've got if, and here's where your criteria is going to be. And then if that is true, whatever's in here is going to be executed. And you could just be that. You could just say that. If something is true, then do something. So let's go back here. So what's the test? If my number is less than or equal to 5, then do this. You don't need an else. You could just run this with an if. You don't have to have an else. But we did throw in an else. So if it's less than or equal to 5, it's going to do something. Otherwise, if it's not, it'll do this. So always something will happen. Just depends on which one of these happens. It's going to do this or this no matter what. What are we going to do? We're going to go into the document. We're going to get the element by ID. So we're going to get the heading. We're going to talk to that heading. We're going to change its inner HTML. Let's pull this over here. And what are we going to do? We're going to just change the text to say something. So we know whether it was true or false. So if it's less than or equal to 5, we're just going to say, hey, the number is less than or equal to 5, just to make sure that we knew that our test worked. Inner HTML, what if that's not true? Let's change the inner HTML to the number is greater than 5, right? Because if it's not less than or equal to 5, it's got to be greater than 5. So let's preview this in the page. And the text says the number is greater than 5. But let's try this out. Let's put this in, and let's say 3. The number is 3. That's what we're testing. The number is less than or equal to 5. So if we say 1 and we refresh, that's less than or equal to 5. If I say 5, that's less than or equal to 5 because it's still 5. And if I say 6, then that's going to be greater than 5. I know this is a very simple example of just if this number or that number, but you can test for any criteria. You could test to see if the user has chosen blue and then go set a product image to show the blue product image by changing the source attribute of the image. The main point of this is that we can do tests, and you can test lots of criteria, not just numbers, right? And you can do anything you want, and it can be as many things as you want. Here I'm just doing one thing, but you can put as many things as you want on a bunch of different lines in here, and all of that stuff will happen if this particular criteria is true. And just to reiterate, you don't have to have an else if you don't want to. If you just want, if something is true, do something. Otherwise, do nothing. That's fine too. Just depends on what you want to do. So those are really the core basics of JavaScript. With that, there are a lot of methods and properties and objects to learn about, but that's a lot of the core of JavaScript to get you started learning more stuff. Okay. So this is actually a perfect time. We're about halfway through. We'd like to take a 5-minute stretch break, restroom break. I'll start the timer here. So go use the restroom, grab a drink. I'll put on some music during the time here, but we'll resume in 5 minutes. If you're watching the recording of this later, you can skip ahead 5 minutes. Okay, so let's turn off the music here. Okay. Back to the live stream here. Hopefully you had a nice little stretch break there. Grabbed a refreshing drink. So that was core plain vanilla JavaScript, as some people like to call it. Oops, sorry about that. Accidentally bumped the microphone. There are JavaScript libraries. And basically a JavaScript library, anybody can create a library. And it's kind of like a library. Somebody writes books and you go and you check them out. JavaScript is kind of the same way in that people can write JavaScript code and you can kind of check it out and use it. They write the code, they save it as a JavaScript file, and you basically link to that JavaScript file, and then you've imported all the code that they've written, and you can take advantage of that code. So if I know how to do a particular thing in JavaScript, and you want to be able to do that, I could write a library, which is just a JavaScript file that does the thing you want to do. I can give you that JavaScript file. You can link to that JavaScript file. All you have to do is call my JavaScript. So I'm probably going to write like a function. If you think about it, I'll write a function and you just have to call that function. You don't have to really know what that function does other than, how you're supposed to use it. Like, what does it work on? And you just have to call that function. So it's pre-written JavaScript that just lets you do easier development because other people that might know things that you don't can write the JavaScript and you can still take advantage of it even though you don't know how to create that yourself. So instead of you writing it, somebody else writes it, the library just gives that code to you. So they can save a tremendous amount of time and you could just do things beyond your coding ability. One of the most famous libraries is called jQuery. jQuery is JavaScript query. Query means to question the document, and basically it's going to question the document it's going to query the document to find an element, and then you're going to do something to it. So it's like, hey, let's make it a little easier to find something in the document and do something to that. jQuery is free to use. It makes it easier to target elements instead of doing the whole document.getElement by ID. And it actually gets a little bit trickier if you want to do classes because an ID is a single element, but a class actually could be lots of elements. So then how do you deal with that? Dealing with events, all that sort of stuff. jQuery just makes this easier. So basically jQuery is just a bunch of JavaScript that somebody wrote. It's not just a single person. It's a big community of people that got together and wrote it and put a lot of great thought into it. And it was written so that you can take advantage of it. But the way that they wrote it, they wanted to actually make it easier than writing plain vanilla JavaScript. So the way that they created the jQuery function, if you will, if you think about it that way, is that you can call their thing and it can do lots of stuff. But because you're calling their code, you can write things in a little bit of a different way. So let's see how it works. I'm going to go back to my code editor and go into the jQuery folder. And let's see, preview this in the page. Right now, this read more does not work, but it's very common for us to want to see a little bit of a teaser of information, and then when you click read more, for it to expand and show more content. And then for that read more to end up becoming less text, or read less, and then it will go up and make it less. Right now, that doesn't work. So what do we do to just get the page to this? For right now, we have two paragraphs. One you see, this tart donut croissant, and then there's a more paragraph that you don't see. So if I go back, so you just see that one paragraph. The more text is hidden. How do we hide that? Just using standard CSS. The more class that we applied, it just says display none. So it tells that more text to display none. So that's how we hid it. So initially it's not visible. Then we have a link that says read more, and we call that button. Right? So basically we want to watch for when the button is clicked, and we want to change the more so that you can see it. Okay. So the first thing is that jQuery is it's files. When you go to the jQuery website, let's go back here to my presentation. If I go back here to the jQuery link, that goes to jQuery.com. When you download jQuery, you can actually go in and download the jQuery file. Download your file for you. Right, you get this minified version of jQuery. There's other ways you can also load jQuery as well. And I think they might have some of them on here. But let me just go back to my code just to be a little bit quicker. So I've already got the jQuery file. Now in this case, I have regular jQuery and minified. On their website, they have two choices of things to download. They have the full jQuery, where you can actually read through all the jQuery code that they've written, or the minified version. Now the minified version is just a few lines. Things that had proper names are now shortened to A, B, and C, and all the white space has been removed. The minified version is the same exact code with the same exact functionality as the regular one. It's just a smaller file size. So for example, if I go to check out how big this is, just by removing white space, by removing returns, tabs, spaces, and shortening names from human readable names to A, B, C, D, they went from 259K down to 86K. It's a lot smaller. People that are viewing your web page don't need to read jQuery. You might be interested in reading jQuery, so that's why you might want to keep that around just to kind of check it out. But when you're linking your web page, you want to link your web page to this JavaScript file. So in this page, at the bottom of the page, down here right before the end of the body, we have linked to jQuery here. We put it in a JavaScript folder, and we link to the minified version. That's one way you can do it. Or the other way you can also do it is there are content delivery networks, or CDN for short. These content delivery networks, such as the Google API's website, they store copies permanently, forever, of jQuery. And as new versions come out, they update those. And you can pull the same jQuery minified version right from the Google API's website. Why might you want to do this? Most likely, this would probably be faster in most instances for a few reasons. When you're loading your website, the number of files you can download per domain are limited. And by loading files from a different domain, you kind of open up another download slot. So you should be able to download this faster because it's coming from a different domain. That's one reason. But another reason is because if multiple different websites all link to the same file, if somebody goes to one website that loads this file, and then they come to your website that loads the same file, if that file is in their browser cache, they don't have to re-download it when they come to your site. And it can be cached, even though it's coming from different websites in a way. Technically, this file it's being used by your website, and it's being used by the other website, but this file is coming from Google APIs. So as long as it's coming from the same exact place, it can be cached across different websites. So the more people use this on their websites, the faster it is for end users. And Google servers are also fast for downloading it, so this can be a bit of a faster way to do it. The only thing is that if you ever want to develop offline when you're not connected to the internet, the local file will always work. Of course, loading it from a live website wouldn't necessarily work. So I'm just going to keep it local for right now, which will work just fine. Okay, so when you're loading jQuery, you put your jQuery code into a script tag, or you can put it in a separate JavaScript file. I'm just putting it into a script tag here to keep this simple. Okay, so we're going to start here with document.ready. jQuery has this notion of when is the document ready? Earlier we talked about loading order, and if you try to fire off your JavaScript code prematurely, it's going to fail. If you load it before the elements loaded, it's going to fail. jQuery doesn't have that problem as long as you use document.ready. If you put your code into the document.ready, it will check to see if the document's ready, if those elements have been loaded, and it will wait until they have been loaded, and then it will fire as soon as it can at its earliest convenience. So this is how jQuery works. It says, find this, and then do this. So it's finding the document and seeing if it's ready. Okay. Now, you need to have a little bit more code to use document.ready. Within the ready method, because ready, like when it's ready, what are you going to do? We put inside of that a function. Now, this function doesn't have any name because we don't call it by name. The ready method knows to fire any code off as soon as the document's ready. So this is an unnamed or anonymous function. And we need the function in here to hold our code so that it doesn't happen right away, because this is still JavaScript. And if you just have plain old JavaScript sitting out there, it'll be executed right away. So by putting it into a function that says, hold this and wait, and as soon as the document's ready, it'll fire off this unnamed function. Doesn't matter that it's not named. And then because it's a function, you put in these curly braces to hold all the stuff you want to do. Okay, so now let's go to here. So within the document.ready, we've got the function that will fire off as soon as the document's ready. What is it going to do? It's going to say, and so this $, that's the jQuery function. Instead of having to write jQuery out, which you could write jQuery out, they just said, hey, let's make this easy to type. We'll just do $, because nobody else is going to use $, hopefully. And that'll just make it quicker than typing out jQuery. Okay. Query the document for something. What is it? In quotes, you put in the selector that you would normally use in CSS. So they use the same syntax that you already know from targeting elements in CSS. So if this was an ID, you would use hashtag. If you're targeting a class, you would say dot. If it's an HTML element like a heading 1, you don't put anything. Just like you do in CSS, you do the same thing here. So in this case, I have a class, a button, and I'm going to target it by dot button. So jQuery makes selecting elements easier. You don't have to say get element by ID or get element by class. You don't have to know how many of them there are or anything. Just if I find a button, what do I want to do? Well, hey, I want to see if it's clicked. If it's clicked, then do something. Right now, that's just nothing's going to happen because it's just tracking to see if something was clicked. Okay. So let's see, what do we want to do if it's been clicked? All right. So here, when the document's ready, when the button's clicked, and again, we have another function when the thing is clicked, because a lot of methods in jQuery, just like the ready method, the click method, they fire off the function that's sitting inside of them. And that's just so that that code doesn't happen right away. It happens when the method is going to be enacted. So we typically often have the method and then a function inside. What are we going to do? Let's just throw an alert, right? This is just regular JavaScript here, but it's all happening when jQuery says the document's ready and the button's clicked. Notice we don't have to go to the button and add like an on-click event to the button. jQuery is separately just targeting that element without us having to go and write code on that element. So when I click on it, it says you clicked me. So I know that that at least works. I don't want to actually do that, but at least I know that jQuery is tracking that clickable element. Okay. So what do we want to do? We want to tell the more paragraph, which has a class of more. Let's check that out. If you forgot, there's a class of more. We want to tell that to slide toggle. So slide toggle is a method built into jQuery that will slide it open or closed. It toggles it back and forth. So let's refresh the page. Boom. Boom. How awesome is that? I didn't have to know how to animate over time, test to see if it's open or if it's closed. It's just dynamically doing all of that built into slide toggle. So if you actually look at the slide toggle code, there's going to be a bunch of code that jQuery wrote, the people behind jQuery wrote, to make that work. But effectively, we've written essentially 1, 2, 3 lines of code. Granted, there's the ending things here. If you didn't have all this other stuff here, this is how it would look. Like that. It'd be a whopping 5 lines of code to do that. Pretty amazing. You could never write that fast yourself using plain JavaScript. Okay, but let's go back. I'm going to undo that. And let's do a little bit more. Because it's not quite good enough to just open that up. Because now I can't click read more and read more. It really is it should be read less. Okay, so I now need to say, hey, that button, I want to change its appearance. Right, so let's go up. I've created some styles here. Normally, the button has a background image of the arrow facing down. It doesn't repeat. It's over on the bottom right of that. And then when it's open, I just wanted to change the arrow to an up arrow. So this little arrow right here, that is on the button. And then if it's got an open class, it would change the thing to an up arrow. So I want to set the class. And jQuery has a toggle class because the first time I want to add it, and then the second time I want to remove it. So it's going to toggle it. Just like it toggles it open and closed, it's going to toggle the class for the button. So tell the button to toggle the open class. So now when I click on it, now the arrow changes. Because I had the CSS normally to show the down arrow, the open class gets added. And if you use the inspector to inspect this, you can see when I click it, you can see that the class is being added. And you can also see that jQuery is doing different CSS directly to that paragraph here to try to hide and show it. Okay, we could do more. Because right now, that's great that the arrow changes, but it still should say read less. Okay, so this is why we did tests earlier. We want to do a JavaScript test. Now, this is just a regular JavaScript test, but then we're going to target things through jQuery. We're going to say if the button has an open class, right? If it has a class of open, then do this first thing. Because if it's open, then it should say read less. Otherwise, it should go back to saying read more. That's the else. So if it's open, say read less. So now it says read less. And that happens every time we click the button. It'll do the test. So if it doesn't have open, it'll change it back to read more. So we can create this cool functionality with not very many lines of code. Okay. All right, so that's an example of core jQuery. But people have taken jQuery and done lots of really cool stuff with it. And they've created what are called plugins. And plugins are just somebody writing a bunch of jQuery code and packaging it in such a way that it's like they're adding a new method, if you will, to jQuery. It wasn't something pre-made by jQuery because jQuery can't create everything under the sun. They've created kind of core functionality. And then let's say you want to write a slideshow. There's a billion different ways to write a slideshow. So there might be, hundreds of different slideshow plugins for jQuery. They used jQuery. They wrote code just like I wrote, but they packaged it in such a way that you could just call their plugin by pretty much a single name to just say, hey, do that cool functionality to my stuff. Some of them are very simple to implement. Some have a bit more settings and a bit more setup. But tons of developers have done this. It's one of the reasons that jQuery has become so popular is because people use it to create these plugins, and then you can get them either for free or they're relatively inexpensive. Even if you'd have to pay $50 or even $100 for some of these plugins, compared to the time it would require you to write the code, it would be totally worth it. But a lot of times, even an expensive plugin might be like $50 or something. A lot of them are like 10, 20 or something, but a lot of them are just free. So I'm going to show you a bunch of free, or several free plugins. So here are just a few example ones. There are a billion different jQuery plugins out there. I have example pages and then also the project page, which tells you instructions on how to use it. And that's one thing about jQuery plugins. Some plugins are created by amazing developers and they document everything super well. And then other plugins are made by somebody that maybe isn't so great, or maybe they're a great coder, but they just didn't document it very well. So because anybody can create a plugin and put it out there, you'll find that the quality and the documentation varies greatly. The best plugins are well coded and well documented and are easier to implement. But if you find one that it's hard to figure out, what does this do? How do I implement it? Remember that you didn't write it. Somebody else did. And if they don't tell you how to use it, it's kind of hard to figure it out on your own without doing a lot of work. So maybe look for a better plugin that's better coded and documented. So scroll line. Let's take a look at this one first. It puts a little scroll line at the top so that you kind of get a sense of how far you are in the scrolling of the story. This is especially useful when you're on mobile devices that don't always have constant scroll indicators on the right. And so you still always get this small little sense of your progress through a story. Okay. So that's one example. Here's another one, single page scroll. This is a very boring looking example, but the functionality is cool. Lots of sites have single page sites that you just scroll up and down. Now you can scroll up and down yourself, Or you can click on any of these and notice that it slowly, or not necessarily slowly, but smoothly scrolls from section to section. Also, as I scroll, notice it highlights the proper section as well in the navigation as I do that. So I can jump to it myself, or it still tells me which section I'm in. So really popular on single page sites. And lastly, lazy loading. I mentioned this on the Giphy website. In here, as soon as you start to go to the images down below, then they will load. But the page loaded virtually instantly because it didn't load any of those images until I see them, and then it goes and loads them. So the initial page load is really fast and only loads images if you ever get there. That's really nice on mobile data plans because the initial page load will happen really quick, and then it also doesn't take away a lot of their data, so it doesn't cost them. And then if they go down further and need to see the images, that's when those images will be loaded. Somebody was asking in the chat if there are any calendar plugins. I'm not sure in particular if there are, but all I do whenever I want to search for functionality is I just go onto Google and I type in jQuery and then whatever it is. So in that case, just search for Google, search Google for jQuery calendar or jQuery calendar plugins. And jQuery has so many plugins. You'll probably find a bunch of different ones. And it's just a matter of finding the one that has the functionality that you like. Okay, so let's take a look. Enough about talking about them. Let's see how to use some of them. All right. So the first thing is you have to download the files that they provide. And I've already done that. I've got, for example, a scroll line. We're going to start with a scroll line. And they will always give you a JavaScript file because jQuery is JavaScript. So they're going to have all of their stuff here in a JavaScript file. They may or may not have a minified version of it. If they have a minified version, always link your document to the minified version. They might have a README file here where you can read about how to use it. Typically, they have on their website examples of this and documentation. So here they let you download an example as well if you want to kind of check out their code. But they're at least going to give you a JavaScript file. They may give you CSS files as well, depending on the complexity of the layout that they're doing. So you might have to link your document to both the CSS as well as the JavaScript. So in my case, I created a page here where it's just a bunch of text and there's a couple sections. Oh, no, sorry. There's just a bunch of text. This is just a long document. And we want to put that scroll line across the top to indicate where we are throughout this document. Okay. So it doesn't have it right now. Just an ordinary page with a ton of content. Okay, let's go to the bottom. The first thing is you have to link to jQuery because jQuery plugins rely on jQuery. They wrote jQuery code and potentially other plain JavaScript code too. But you link to the jQuery code. Then you link to the plugin file itself. So in this case, in my JavaScript folder, I have my jQuery. I've linked to that. In my JavaScript folder, I have scroll line, and I created a folder for that, and I have the JavaScript for there. So you're linking to that. That does not necessarily do anything other than load the functionality. Most of the time, that's not enough. You need to tell it what you want to do with that plugin. What do you want to apply it to? So you're typically going to have a document.ready because we always want to make sure the document's ready to do what we want to do in jQuery. And in this case, based on his website, the person that created this, they said to call scroll line, just say, hey, jQuery, do scroll line. Okay. So they created a scroll line method that we're going to call, or function, if you will. And we're just going to call it. And let's go back and reload the page. And boom, look at that. It's already been added. We don't even have to understand what they're doing. We just have to call their plugin. And I didn't make up this code myself here. I just got it from their site because they have to tell you what they named their plugin. So they define a name and they say, this is how you call it. Now, some plugins you could just call and you're done, but maybe you don't like the green with the gray. In this case, they let us customize it. Now, they might not let us customize it. We might have to go into the code and kind of hack their plugin to fix it. But if it's a good plugin, they often give you numerous options to customize. Sometimes they'll let you customize it through a CSS, or they might let you customize it through the jQuery itself. So basically, if you take the code that we have up there and you look at it like this, document.ready, we call scroll line. the way that you customize a jQuery plugin is you have to pass it some parameters. So we have these curly braces that hold all the parameters that we're going to pass to scrollline. So scrollline wants a bunch of options, and these curly braces put together those options and send it to scrollline. And these options are given to us. They're defined by the plugin. We can't just make up our own. So we read about these on the website for scrollline. So for example, if I go back to scrollline, if you look at the project page for scrollline, they tell you, they're like, hey, link to jQuery, link to scrollline, and then just call that to launch the plugin. And then here are options, right? So here's, you can do options. And here's an example with some of those options set. So you could just copy this, paste it into your code, and then just tweak some of the settings. Basically what we did. So let's come back here. So the front color could be orange, the back color could be brown, and the weight, which is like the size, could be 15. Let's see that. So now it's different colors and different size. You're like, whoa, that's way too big. That's 15 is huge. You can make it 2. So that's a tiny little thing, although they might be kind of hard to see. But the point is, you can customize that. But it's up to the plugin to determine what you can customize and what you can't. So that was a pretty quick plugin to implement. Some can be a little bit more detailed. Let's do a single page nav. So in here, I've already set up the HTML for the basics. I can scroll up and down. In fact, I can also click any of these links. But there's a big difference between the example that I showed you earlier and this one. In this one, it doesn't slide up and down the page. It just jumps. So it's kind of hard to even notice that it's scrolling up and down because it just jumps up and down the page. Also, as I scroll, there's no indication up here of which section I'm in. And it would be nice for it to tell me which section I'm in. So I want the animation. I want the indication of which section I'm in. This is just done with standard HTML. Let me show you how to do that if you don't know that. Here we have a list of links that target an ID. So down here on this heading 1, I put an ID of clause, and this links to that ID. So that links to that section. There's IDs of pause and toys. So if I go down here, here's the ID of pause. So you just put an ID on the element that you want to link to, and then you can create a link that links to that. Start your link with the hashtag and then the name of your ID. So that just gives you the basic linking functionality up and down the page. Okay. So now we need to do some JavaScript, some jQuery. We're going to do document.ready like we always do. So, well, first of all, let's back up. We got a link to jQuery. Then we've got a link to the plugin. And then we have to do document.ready. Now, what are we going to do? Well, we want to call the single page nav. This is the name of their plugin. But what do we want to tell it? Well, we want to tell it, where is that nav? So we added a class of page nav up top here, a class of page nav. So basically, look in the page nav section to find internal page links. So it's going to look in there for links, and it's going to use those to do the sliding up and down. So that's how it knows what navigation to use for its single page navigation. If you just do that, it'll work. Let's refresh the page. Now notice it slides. Cool. So literally 3 lines of code here and linking to jQuery and that. So 5 lines of code added pretty much. And we've got the scrolling going on. If you just want that, you could stop right there. But notice that as I scroll, I don't see the indicator of which section I'm in. Let's inspect the page to see what's going on. I'm going to inspect these 3 links. And let's make this a little bit smaller. As I scroll, notice this current class as I scroll. That current class is changing. The plugin is changing it based on your scroll position. So they're adding a current class. Now, if there's a current class, I can style that current class. I don't have a style for it yet, but I can make one. So they're already doing the highlighting. It's just they're doing it by putting a class, and then we have to define how we want this to look. Let's go up to our CSS. I already have a style ready to go. It just was commented out. The page nav, inside of that, there's a link with a class of current. I just want to change the color of the text. We'll make it orange. Save that. Come back and refresh. Now notice as I scroll that one of those is going to be highlighted in orange. The class was already being added. I just had to style it. So that's where using the inspector to go in there and see what's going on can sometimes show you what plugins are doing. And also, if it's well documented, they would tell you that on their documentation. Oh, to change the highlight, create a current class and style it however you want. That's why they're doing it through a class. They're not assuming you want to change the background or the color, or there's a billion things you could change with CSS. So they're like, well, we'll just put a name on it and you can target it and you can style it however you want. Okay. One more thing, one more plugin, the Unveil plugin. This is the lazy loading plugin. So in this case, we've got some text. And let's take a look here. We've got a bunch of text in our code. And here, normally, let me delete this for a second. Normally, you would have image with source attributes. Now, we're loading these from the Noble desktop website rather than locally. Normally, you'd have relative links to your document. But we're loading these from the website because we need it to take a little bit of time to load, or else it's going to be so quick you're not going to notice the lazy loading. But if you do this, the images would be there right away. What we do to prevent that is this plugin requires that you add data dash in front of your source. So using data dash source, that will prevent the images from loading right away when the page loads. So now the images don't load. And what we'll do is we'll use JavaScript to change the data source back into a source. We're not going to write it. The plugin's going to do it. So we load jQuery. We load the Unveil plugin. We use document.ready. And then we're just going to say on all images. And notice here we have the single quotes because we copied this from their website and they had double quotes. It doesn't matter whether you use double or single quotes. Normally, as I've been doing in the past in this seminar, I've been doing single quotes, but it's okay if you use double quotes. That's fine as far as JavaScript is concerned. Tell all images to be unveiled. And this is going to kind of do a pretty basic thing in concept. There's a lot of details that need to be done to make it work. But when this image scrolls into view, it will take whatever this value is from the data and it will add a source attribute with the same value. And once it has a source attribute, then the image will load. So let's save that. Come back to the browser and hit refresh. And as I scroll, now it happens really quick, but you see there's a little bit of a delay. Now I'm going to actually go into Safari here. And let's load this in Safari. I like Safari here for this one demonstration a little bit nicer, because when you go into their inspector and you load the page, you get your file size right there very easily. So notice 90K loaded. That could not be any of those images. Those are big images. As I start to scroll to those images, boom, that just loaded. And I made these images really big because I wanted them to take a long time. Normally they probably wouldn't need to be that big. I wanted to delay the loading. See how the image size just keeps stacking up. And if I scroll quickly, I mean, we got a fast internet connection here, so it kind of already loaded those pretty quickly. But initially, when the page first loaded, if you're at the top here, it only loads 90K. I mean, that thing loads super fast until you get to the image and boom, then it loads in. So imagine on mobile, this page is going to load super fast. And then as you need the images, if you need the images, it'll go and grab them. But this is the cool thing. If you look here, as this page loads, check this out. I just reloaded the page. So here are all the things with the data source attributes. And watch these first images as I get down to them. Boom. All this plugin is doing, it's a very simple concept. When that image comes into view, go and get the data source attribute and make a source attribute the same thing. Boom. Boom. And because it has a source, those sources are loaded automatically and it works. Right? So pretty cool plugin. You don't need a lot of lines of code for that one to work. Literally just a few lines of code for that. So jQuery plugins, absolutely phenomenal. Can do tons and tons of stuff. That's just a small sampling of some of the things that you can do with jQuery plugins. Now, libraries. jQuery is a very famous library, but it's only one library. There are other libraries out there. You may not have heard of GreenSock. Even if you've heard of jQuery, you might not have heard of GreenSock, or GSAP for short. GreenSock is the GreenSock animation platform. GSAP got its start years ago in Flash. People were coding animations in Flash using ActionScript. And then, of course, Flash, they knew that was going away. They converted everything over. They rewrote the whole thing in JavaScript. And so now we can do animation, high-level animation, with the GreenSock animation platform, or GSAP for short. So GSAP is another JavaScript library, but unlike jQuery, which is kind of an all-around library, and jQuery is awesome for doing lots of various different things, and jQuery can do some animation. jQuery's main focus isn't solely animation. GreenSock is solely focused on animation. So in short, jQuery is all around useful for tons of stuff. Kind of jQuery is like the Swiss Army knife of libraries. Great for lots of stuff. Can do some animation, but if you really want to do a lot of animation, don't use jQuery for animation, use GreenSock. You're going to get better performing animations. They're going to look better, perform better, but they're also, you just have a lot of tools in GSAP that don't exist in jQuery to do animations. You're going to get a code equivalent of a timeline, that one thing happens after another, that happens after another, and happens after another. For the most part, using GreenSock is free, unless you charge for somebody to access your website or your app. It's not if you make money. If you make money off your website, that's fine. But if you block the content and don't let people get to it unless they pay, then you do need to have a GreenSock membership. It's not very expensive, but for most people, you don't actually end up needing to pay anything for GreenSock. And if you don't want to take my word for how amazing this is, there's some great articles, like, for example, this one on CSS tricks, where the author is saying GreenSock is far and away above my favorite library to work with. Talking about animation. He's comparing animation technologies. So it's a great animation technology. We actually worked with GreenSock to create the authorized GreenSock curriculum. And so we have an officially created GreenSock workbook and class. Let me give you some examples of sites that use GSAP. Not everything might be used. Not everything might be created with GSAP, but GSAP was used in at least some of the creation of some of these websites, like the Hunger Games website. This one takes a little bit to load because there's a lot of stuff here. So there's lots of animations and stuff going on, but like, oh, that was kind of cool. The navigation over here is pretty slick. I like the way that works. The things animate in one after another, and then it slides away. So that's just kind of slick, the way that stuff works. So GreenSock has a cool way to do stuff like that. The way that this page loads in is really cool. Tons of slick little things, and then animations that are going on. Even the menu. You know, like the things don't just appear, but they kind of slide up into place, are just nice. It's cool stuff. Was used on a McDonald's website. This does a ton of stuff. I'm not sure if the audio is coming through in your case, but there's actually some audio when you click on some things. Let's go to one of these here. It's like Fruit Ninja. The speed of this is just so fast, the way that this performs. The frame rates are so high. Just really slick, very well performing animation. And this is the kind of stuff we used to have to use Flash to do. And now we can do it natively in the browser. So GSAP was used for that. And on their website, they have a bunch more examples. And I want to walk us through some examples of doing some stuff in GSAP. Okay. At first, when you see GSAP, the basic syntax, like if you see something somebody writes, you might think, oh, what's going on here? Once you get into it, though, the syntax that they write in ends up being very elegant, and you can do a lot of stuff with very little amounts of code. So first thing is you need to load in the GSAP JavaScript. They're using a different content delivery network through Cloudflare. And this link we just got on the GSAP website. You can get it right from there. And you just link, kind of like we were linking to the Google APIs to pull the jQuery library. You can do that through them. You can also download it as well, but generally best if you can to use the CDN link so that everybody's caching it across different websites. So just like we pulled in jQuery's functionality by linking to jQuery, we have to pull in the GSAP library. If you also want to pull in jQuery because you want to use it, that's fine, but GSAP is not dependent on jQuery. It works great with it, but it's not dependent on it. So if you don't want to load jQuery, you don't have to. Okay, so this is where we want to start here. This isn't actually code that's going to work anything. This is just the syntax. So tween max is what we're loading here. Tween max is, tween comes from in between. We're going to basically kind of give the idea of point A and point B, start and finish, and it's going to tween the in-between states to go from point A to point B, or state A to state B. So let's say you're going to tell tween max to go to a certain state. So the initial way the page looks is your starting state. And then we're going to animate to a different state. So we'll start the way the page initially looks and end up going to a different state. You want to tell it what the target is. So what element are you targeting? How long do you want your animation to go? And whatever variables you might want to set. So that's the basic syntax. So let's take a look at an actual example. Now, before I do anything here, let's just load the page. And actually, yeah, so I already have something going. This is what we're going to create. Check that out. So we're having some fun with some animation. That's what we want to do. But let's uncomment that out and see how to do it. Okay. So initially, this is just a boring page with no JavaScript. It just loads these elements. I've got some text there. I've got this logo here. And then I've got in the background, I've got this starburst. So those are three elements here. I've got the logo. I've got the background. And all of that stuff is in a wrapper. So the content is separate from the background. So the content I'm calling logo and the heading one. So that's my content. And the content's separate from the background. So I've kind of named things so I can target them all. Okay. And that's just an image, a heading. And this is a div. And the background has the star as a background. Okay. All right. So I've loaded in my GSAP. And let's see what we want to do. So content, that is my text and logo. We're going to say go to, animate to. So take the content and go to, for 1 second, go to an opacity of 0. Okay, so it's going to go to that. So when I hit refresh, it's going to fade away. It's going to take 1 second to go to an animation, to an end state of 0% opacity. Now you don't probably want something to fade out. So instead of going to something, let's fade from something. We're going to fade from 0%. Okay. Still going to target the content. Take 1 second to do that. So now when the page loads, it's not there, and it fades in. It fades in. I'm just hitting refresh here each time. Okay, so another thing, let's say we don't want to do opacity. Let's say we want to do scale instead. So I'm just swapping out the scale. 50%. So let's scale from 50%. So it starts half the size. Now we can start at 0.1. The reason we do 0.1 instead of 10% is because scale in CSS goes from 0 to 1, 1 being 100%, 2 being 200%. So we're just using like CSS-like values in our JavaScript. Now, if you want to do both, you could do both. You could do opacity and scale. So it's fading and scaling. Okay. Now, let's do them a little bit more efficiently instead of different lines and kind of put things together. And you could do multiple elements. So we're going to start by saying come from a scale of 0.5. So that content will take 1 second to scale in from 50% size. So let's see that. So from 50% size. Then after that, let's take the background. We're coming from 0 opacity, so it'll fade from 0, so it'll fade in, from 0% scale, so it's going to start off 0 and then scale up. But let's tell it to delay by 1 second, because the first thing is going to take 1 second, so we'll offset this element, so it waits a second and then it animates in. It will take 1 second to animate in, but it's going to wait a second, so there's no overlap. Oh, I forgot to save my file, sorry. So the content comes in first, and then the background after a second. If I wait a little bit less, if I do like 0.5 seconds, then there's going to be a little bit of an overlap because the first animation takes 1 second. We're only waiting a half a second. So there's going to be a little bit of an overlap that the background starts coming in just a little before this finishes. Okay. But let's put it back to 1. Then finally, let's tell the heading to come from 0. We're going to come from 200%, so it's going to scale small. And let's wait 2 seconds after all the animations start. Watch this heading down here, comes down. Now, it's a bit tedious to have to keep thinking about how far to delay the stuff. So really, this is not the best way to do this. One of the great things about GSAP is there's an actual timeline. While you can put delays on individual elements, you don't have to do that to create a sense of one thing after another after another. Instead, you can use a timeline. You create a variable which you name whatever you want. Timeline makes sense, but you can name it whatever you want. And then you're going to say, in that variable, store a new timeline. So that creates a new timeline that you can work with within GSAP. And then instead of calling tween max, which is kind of the general timeline, you're going to call your specific timeline. So now you're going to say, within my timeline, let's do things. And because you're using your specific timeline and you keep adding things to your timeline, this will happen first, this will happen second, this will happen third. Just because you're working within your own timeline. 1 thing, 2 thing, 3 thing. 1, 2, 3. One after another. Now, logo, background, heading. If you want to reorder things, all you have to do is just let's move the heading up top first. Now the heading will happen first, just by reordering the code. That's a little bit weird. Heading, then content, and then background, because actually it's starting small. So let's say we want to put that after the content. So the content comes in, then the heading comes in, then the background comes in. Content comes in, then the heading, then the background. All you have to do is reorder your elements, and they automatically change the loading order of this one happens, then this one happens, and then this one happens, because they're all within the sense of a timeline. That sense of a timeline makes things so much easier to code. And this is just a sampling of what GSAP can do. Here's one more example, and then we're going to be wrapping it up shortly. Watch this. Check out all those elements. They just fade right in one after another. This is a really cool thing that GSAP does, where they have a cool thing called stagger from. In here, I have a wrapper that has a bunch of different paragraphs. So in all those paragraphs, I want to take all of those paragraphs, and by saying to stagger from, it's going to know to take every one of those paragraphs and to do the first one, and then the second, and then the second, with a little bit of an offset of time. So this is the thing I'm working with, the paragraph. Each animation is going to take 1 second. It's going to stagger from opacity of 0. So it's going to start at 0 and end up at my current opacity. And the stagger amount is new. So we have to put in a comma with a stagger amount. It's going to offset these by 0.1 seconds. We don't want to wait very long for the next paragraph to come in, but each paragraph will come in 0.1 seconds after the previous paragraph. So let's take a look at this again now. Boom, 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 boom. Each fade in takes 1 second. Now let's say you staggered by 2 seconds. One comes in, 2 seconds later, the next one comes in, 2 seconds later, the next one comes in. That could be interesting, although in this case, for like a fade-in effect, you wouldn't want to do something like that. You'd want it generally to be quick, like 0.2 seconds. Comes in a little bit quicker. Now it's taking a full second to fade in. Maybe that's a little bit much. Maybe 0.2 seconds to fade in. So it fades in quicker. You kind of even don't notice the fade. So we really do need some amount of time to notice the fade. Okay. Now let's say you don't want to do a fade. Let's say you want to do a fade and a scale. You just add in your additional thing. So we're going to fade and scale from 0.5. So scale from 50%. Pretty cool. Okay, let's comment that out. Go to the next one. Now we're going to add one more thing, a Y position, minus 80Y. Let's check that out. Y is up and down. It's a vertical. So we're starting minus, which was up. So we're starting from a higher position, so it comes down to the final position. If you did a positive 80, it would come up to that versus coming down from that. So it fades in, scales in, and moves in. And so now when you start to go back and look at something like Claudio's website, this menu where the things come in, it's just a stagger from. Not to take anything away from it, but it's that particular effect is easier than you might have thought it was. And when you look at the Hunger Games, when you look at the thing on the right for the navigation, when they slide in from the right, slightly offset, they're doing an X position instead of a Y with a stagger from. So GreenSock can do tremendous things. That's just a sampling of what it's going to be like to use it. We have a lot more learning that you can do. We have just scratched the surface of what JavaScript and jQuery and GreenSock can do. If you want to learn GreenSock, I definitely recommend learning the basics of JavaScript first before getting into GreenSock. So if you were just new to all of this stuff, I would recommend going through some JavaScript tutorials or our training before doing GreenSock, just so you have some core JavaScript skills under your belt. For the JavaScript jQuery training, you can do that live in New York City in person or live online. It's not recorded videos that you just attend. You actually attend during these class times. You tune in and you're joining the live class. If you're doing it online, you're just screen sharing into the instructor's computer, but you get the same workbook that you get if you come to class. We send you an ebook version of it that you can use to follow along step-by-step, great, awesome workbooks. If you can't make the class either online or in New York City, you can always check out our books. Great step-by-step workbooks. You can buy them in print, or you can buy an ebook where you can download it right away. The ebooks come in 3 formats. You get a PDF that you can either view on your computer or digital device, or you can print it. And we also give you an ebook format of an EPUB or a MOBI. The EPUB is loadable on any e-reader except for Kindles. For Kindles, you have to load the MOBI file, and so you can load these ebooks onto any devices, and they look great on all the devices. And then we also have the GreenSock book as well, GreenSock class and GreenSock book. So you can check that out as well. So I'm going to open this up to questions in the chat if anybody has them. And just in case people don't have questions, just want to thank everybody for attending. The live stream URL for the presentation is going to be in the notes for this video. Whether you're watching the recording or the live one, that URL is in the video description. I'm also pasting into the chat for those that are attending the live stream live. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like this video if you liked it. We'll be sending a link to this video to those of you who attended live. That'll go out once the video is processed and ready to go out. So it's Friday today. That'll probably go out on Monday. But you can always come back to our YouTube channel and check out all of our recorded live streams on our YouTube channel. And if you subscribe, then you will have an easier time finding them in the future. We have a question in the chat about code editors. My favorite is Sublime Text. I like Sublime Text because there's a lot of developer community around Sublime. There's tons of packages that you can add on to create cool functionality within Sublime Text. As kind of second choices, if I wasn't using Sublime Text, I would like to use either something like Atom or Brackets. Would probably be like my second choice. If I wasn't using Sublime, I'd probably go to Atom. But in terms of speed and add-ons, there's a lot of great features that are part of Sublime Text that are built in or that you can add on through packages. And Sublime Text has a free trial that you can try out for as long as you want. And then if you like it, it's $70 to purchase a license. All right, any other last questions in the chat? While I'm waiting for those, just wanted to say thank you one more time to everybody that joined us, whether you were live or watching this recording. Hope you enjoyed, and be sure to check out Noble Desktop for future learning, and be sure to subscribe and click the like button if you like the video. All right, until I see you next time in a future live stream. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again.